This is the podcast all about energy, vitality and motivation. I'm Tony Whiten. You're listening to Zestology. Thank you for listening. Normally I record these podcasts out and about, or the intro bit at least. But, this might sound a bit wussy from the man who's recorded a podcast in a cryotherapy chamber, but it's just very cold outside. And I've got an excuse, because when it's very cold, I've got to wear my big coat. And when I'm wearing my big coat, it rustles on the intro. So I've come inside for today's podcast and next week's podcast. I hope that's all right with you. I'll have to do 3 cryotherapy sessions this week as punishment, won't I? Anyway, on to today's podcast. And recently, I started a new diet. When I say recently, in the last year or so, it's completely changed my life. I've spoken about this a few times before on Zestology. I am so passionate about it that this week's podcast and next week's podcast looks into the low histamine diet. It's easily the biggest health and wellness change of the last kind of 12 to 24 months for me. But actually, probably the last 25 years. It's made a huge difference to my life. It's an absolute game changer. I have more energy, I'm more in shape, I'm less bloated, and so on. Yeah, it's been the best change on a Zestology theme for a long time. So in this podcast, we look into a real passion of mine, and that is something, it's quite a complex issue. It's MCAS and histamine intolerance. So MCAS, mast cell activation syndrome, and histamine intolerance. Between 9 and 15% of the population have it, and that might be you, and you don't even know it. 15%, that's a lot of people. And for quite a long time, I heard this word, or these words, histamine intolerance, kicking around. I didn't really know what it was all about. Hopefully we can kind of demystify that a little bit today on this podcast, and see if you've got it. And we start with Beth's story. Then we get on to talking more generally about allergies and how they can be an absolute killer in terms of performance. A little bit about my experience of histamine intolerance as well. You might be feeling really not very well at the moment, in which case you're going to enjoy this podcast, you're going to be interested in the content. But you might be feeling kind of 98% and you want to take it to 100%. And that is where I think looking at allergies, because there's so many allergies out there, and how they can be a killer in terms of performance can really help. So I'm very excited about it. I'm really excited in talking more about histamine intolerance. As you know, I've kind of set up a histamine intolerance blog, which is histamineintolerance.net. It's histamineintolerance.net, and I've just kind of written it's a little passion project, little side project, a few little blogs on histamine intolerance. And I am really chuffed to speak to an absolute expert in Beth O'Hara.
Well, I entered all this a little differently than most practitioners. So I never had great health as a child. I just always had digestive problems. Things just, I had trouble sleeping. I had a head injury as a child. I was kicked by a horse, and then had significant insomnia starting at age 9. I grew up in the country. We were playing outside all the time. I was bit by many ticks. I've had Lyme from a young age. And it was an old farmhouse. And we didn't know at the time, but it was full of mold. And so I got mold toxicity as a young child. And so my health just was never my strong suit. But I was really driven to become a doctor. And so at age 6, I decided that's what I was going to do. And I unlike a lot of kids, you think about all kinds of things. And I thought of other things. I'd be an astronaut or a teacher, but that always held true. I was going to be a doctor. Really, really was my dream. And when I got into college, I did well in college, but my health kept declining. And I had multiple scholarships to medical school. I had to turn them all down. So as you can imagine, Tony, that was absolutely devastating to not be able to pursue my dream because
you just weren't feeling well enough to go and do it.
I just couldn't function anymore. I had driven myself really hard in college and worked 3 jobs to put myself through college and did independent research and all these things to prepare for going to medical school. And when I hit my senior year, my body just gave out. I had severe chronic fatigue. I eventually developed significant joint pain and issues to where I could barely walk even using a cane. And I have been, by the time I got to where I couldn't walk, leading up to that even, I'd worked really hard for my health and trying to improve my health after I crashed in college. Now, before that, I didn't know anything about taking care of my health, and I ate out of vending machines and had pizza and ramen noodles, and that's kind of was my diet. And then I realized I had to change my diet to get well, and I worked really hard on my health. I worked hard on my fitness. I became fairly athletic and did a lot of bicycle riding, and I would do these intense yoga practices. And then I had another huge crash with the joint involvement, and not being able to walk was horrible. The pain was excruciating.
So 1 minute you're doing loads of exercise and then you get so ill you can't walk.
It was kind of a gradual decline over a few months. So it wasn't like overnight, but over a few months, gradual decline. I ended up with severe anxiety, and I would have panic attacks. I couldn't leave my house. And I was basically hit a point where I was debilitated. I couldn't work. It was a good day if I got out of bed by 2 p.m. and got the dishwasher loaded, and unloading the dishwasher was going to have to wait till the next day. And this is coming from somebody who was used to working 3 jobs and doing independent study. And I just always had a lot of things going on. And all of a sudden, my whole world collapsed. And I had nothing that I could accomplish or do. I was convinced my husband would leave me. He must really love me because he didn't. And I just felt like I had nothing to offer the world or to offer my partner. And then the real breaking point, I had seen at that point over 50 practitioners. I totaled up at one point, I've spent over $150,000 US dollars on my health. And I was at the best functional medicine practitioner in my whole area. It was an hour drive for me to get to him. And I would have to drag myself to that appointment. Sometimes I'd have to get somebody to drive me because I couldn't drive myself. And we had worked together for about 3 or 4 years, and everything we tried made me worse. L-glutamine gave me worse anxiety. Curcumin made me inflamed. Everything made my sleep even worse, and it was already bad. And one day he said to me, Beth, I don't know what else to do for you. We've tried everything I know to do, and everything I give you makes you worse, and I'm out of options. And I really appreciated his honesty. And it was also, I felt so hopeless because if he didn't know, who knew? And I got home and I just cried for a few hours because it's like, well, where else do I go? I've already seen 50 people. I'd done everything I could do in traditional medicine, holistic medicine. I tried homeopathy. I've been told repeatedly it was all in my head and I was crazy. I had done therapy. Nothing was improving me. And I reached out to someone I knew in a small group I was in on Facebook, small group of female practitioners. And I was a health coach at this time already. And this woman said, run your genetics. So I said, I don't know what else to do. And she said, run your genetics. I bet you're going to find some options. And this was like 8-9 years ago. So this was really new back then. So I ran my genetics and she helped me and we started to look through it. And it was like, boom, we were just looking at 60 genetic variants at that point in time. Now I'm at over 10,000. But just in the 60, it was like, oh, well, that makes sense why I'm not tolerating glutamine. That makes sense why I'm not tolerating curcumin, and so on and so on. And that was the entry point to start to get well. And then I realized I'm going to have to go back and become that doctor I wanted to be. But instead of it being in traditional medicine, I'm going to do it in functional naturopathy. And that's what I did. And through learning how to take this functional approach and this root cause approach, I got my health back. And I figured out how to do an individualized protocol for myself. And I can tell you today, I can hike 2 miles. I run a busy practice. I work full time. I feel really good. And, 14 out of 15 nights, I have a really good night's sleep. And every once in a while, I still have a little disturbed sleep, particularly if I have a little too much chocolate or something.
Yeah. Talk to me about the chocolate. Yeah. I've got a feeling this podcast might involve quite a lot of chocolate and avocado, but we'll go through those.
We'll have some chocolate tips for you, but
good. Yeah.
So that's how I built this practice. So it came from my own experience, and it was such a dramatic turnaround coming off of that cane and being able to walk again. And people just started coming to me saying, "Oh my gosh, last time I saw you could barely walk, and now you look radiant. You look completely different and healthy. What happened?" And that's just how the practice was built. So I developed this practice, Mast Cell 360, to be the dream practice I wish had existed when I was ill and couldn't find the help that I needed.
So what happened was, when you started to recover, it was really because you ran your genetic results, which in those days was quite primitive and is a lot more advanced now, and you were able to say, okay, I've got genetic variants, which means that my body just works differently in certain areas to other people. Is that a fair assumption of how you actually looked at it?
Yes, that was a huge piece. So I looked at my genetic predispositions and got a lot of clues, and then I combined that with getting the right functional labs, because the traditional lab work, a CBC, the things that generally run in a traditional medical office, all look normal, and then I would be told I was healthy while I was hobbling in on a cane. But when I got the right functional labs, we saw a lot of things that were out of whack. And that gave me the insights on what I needed to balance. And then I had to develop an approach that starts from the ground up. And that's where I find makes the biggest difference in people that keep falling through the cracks, is things have to be introduced in mast cell activation syndrome and histamine intolerance in the right order, at the right time, which is different for each person. And that's why there's no blanket approach for these things. There's no standard protocol.
Right. And so in podcast number 2 that we record, part 2, you've actually got access to my genetics and you've had a look through them, haven't you? And that's going to be part of what we look at.
Exactly. We're going to look at your genetics, and we're going to look at a functional test called the organic acid test.
Yeah.
They gave me some big clues on, I think, what's going on with your histamine intolerance, which is going to be different than my histamine intolerance and other people's.
Good. Well, I can't wait for that, and I think people will genuinely be interested. But don't skip, if you're listening to this and part 2's already come out, don't skip to that yet, because we've got some important stuff to talk about here. And I think part of that is that I've noticed that a lot of people who have symptoms ranging from the irritating to the extreme, they do just go on, and you can end up seeing a lot of very good people and putting a lot of thought into it, and ultimately not much changes. That might range from anxiety to a dodgy hip to kind of not sleeping that well. People just live with it for years because it is just quite hard to work out sometimes, isn't it?
It really is. It takes, I tell people that this kind of functional approach is extremely effective, and it takes time and it takes a lot of work. And what I do with people is a root cause analysis, because there are different root causes in histamine intolerance and mast cell activation syndrome that can cause that expression. But the mast cell activation syndrome or the histamine intolerance aren't the problem. The dodgy hip isn't exactly the problem. Or the chronic fatigue isn't the problem. These are the body's expression of what's going on underneath. And we have to get to what's going on underneath to be able to shift and actually heal from these things. That's where we make the biggest difference. And I tell people that in traditional medicine, the gold standard of whether or not your protocol is working is, does it help 60 to 80% of people that come through the door? And in that, if you can help 60 to 80% with your approach, that's considered excellent. But then what about the other 20 to 40%? And that's where I always fell. And they just fall through the cracks. And to me, it's not good enough. And we have the technology, we have the testing, we have the knowledge to do way better than that. And that's what I'm always driving for with my clients. So we've gotten that up to 95% with an individualized approach, because that's what makes the difference, is to look at, well, what makes this person unique in their genetics and their health history, and some of the things you shared with me about, like, exactly your travel and when these certain symptoms came on, what was going on at that point in life. And then we keep drilling down. What are the major root pieces in your case specifically? And then we address those.
Yeah. So obviously in the title of this podcast, we've kind of mentioned allergies and performance. There are a whole load of people listening to this who will say, yeah, I've got allergies. How is it affecting my performance? So what percentage of people are affected by allergies? How mild or severe can they be? And how are people affected?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we talk about allergies. There's many different types of allergy expressions. And the one that I know the best and talk about the best is mast cell activation syndrome. And this is an allergy type situation because the mast cells, and that's MAST as in Tom, so mast cells are the frontline immune cells. They're the ones, like, if we think about the body as being like a castle, they're the front guards of the gate that know how to recognize an enemy and sound the alarm, or recognize that, oh, these are nutrients coming in, we're going to allow this in. This is a healthy food, we're going to allow this in. And they're the gatekeepers. So the mast cells are in almost all of the tissues in the body. So they're in the skin, the muscles, the brain, the entire digestive tract. They're in organs. And the mast cells can release over 200 different chemicals, which is amazing, and they can selectively release them depending on what's going on, and then orchestrate the rest of the immune response based on that. And the most well-known chemical that the mast cells release is histamine. And that's really, really important because these mast cells are protecting us from toxins and from pathogens. What's happening is that we're living in a much more toxic world than we've ever lived in before. We're having intergenerational expression of toxin issues. So even parents and grandparents that were exposed to toxins, it changes the genetic expression in the generations. And we have so much more exposure to electromagnetic fields from cell phones, electronics. All of these things are confusing to the mast cells, and they're causing dysregulation. So we have dysregulation. We can have different symptoms that show up. One of the most common one is fatigue. And so the mast cells will produce chemicals that cause the body to feel tired and exhausted, telling you to rest. And that can definitely affect performance. There's also classic allergy symptoms. So these are things like itchy eyes, flushing, running nose, hives, itching. But not everybody gets those symptoms. So some people in my practice have different presentations. So I have a client, I'll call her Anna, she does have itching, but a lot of digestive issues and asthma. But another client, she has mouth burning when she eats, and nerve pain and brain fog and fatigue. So she doesn't have that classic allergy symptoms. And then another client has fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, digestive issues, depression, and anxiety. That's what's so tricky about the mast cells and the mast cell activation syndrome, is that you can have so many different symptom presentations.
Yeah. And I mean, I read something somewhere which suggested up to 15% of people might have some kind of issues with histamine. What's your assessment on the percentage of people who might be affected by allergies, whether they know it or not, and the percentage of people who might be affected by either histamine or mast cell activation syndrome?
So allergy in general, probably pretty high. That's getting higher and higher by the decade. And Mast activation syndrome, our estimate is between 9 and 15% of the population. So that's a lot. So that means 1 in 10 at least of the general population. And I find in the chronically ill population, people who just have health issues in general, it's much higher. We don't have any super solid data yet because understanding of mast cell activation syndrome in traditional medicine is very new. So I've been working with it for 7 years. But here in the States, we only got a diagnosis code for this 3 years ago. And the diagnostic criteria, the testing is still in flux in terms of looking for blood markers for mast cell activation syndrome. But it's quite common. And again, for the reasons I'm talking about, and the things that trigger it will be chronic infections, which could be Epstein-Barr, could be Lyme, mold toxicity, and toxins. These are really big ones. Hormone imbalances play a role. The way people eat plays a big role in development of these things, and stress is a big factor in this.
Yeah, I mean, stress is one of those ones where it's very easy to think, why am I not feeling great? I ate well and I went to the gym and everything's going all right, but I think people often discount the huge impact that stress can have on the body. I certainly do. So
I do. I have too. And I this is my career, and my doctorate's in naturopathy, functional naturopathy, but my master's is in marriage and family therapy and psychology. And I did my master's research on the role of the mind and stress states on the immune system and the nervous system and the hormone system. So the field of study is called psychoneuroendocrinoimmunology, which is a big word that just means the stress and mind states and our psychology are so interwoven with our immune system, our nervous system, and our hormone system that we can't, the way that they're being taught in anatomy as separate systems isn't actually accurate. They're all interwoven as the same axis. So that's something I always integrate with people is breath practices. We look at stress states. We look at how people's relationships are going. In addition to working on supplements and working on foods and so on, because I find that some people, if they're not addressing the stress component and the nervous system balance of it, they can take all of the right supplements, eat all the right foods, and still be stalled. And that happened with me too. And then I had to go back to that piece and work on my mind state and being able to stay calm under stress.
Just interrupting this podcast for one moment to remind you that it's brought to you by Sunlighten Saunas, an ultra-low EMF sauna with Netflix in it. Does it get any better? It's really nice for these winter days, get into the sauna, and what I love about the infrared sauna is it's all backed up by a rigorous amount of scientific research that shows that it is excellent for everything from heart health and heart rate variability to detox and relaxation. I've certainly found with my Oura Ring stats that my sleep gets a lot better and deeper, and my heart rate variability seems to get better as well, and I can also feel myself detox in it. I'm actually not going in the sauna for that long at the moment because I'm taking it slowly, because I can tell that it's working and I don't want to over detox, if that makes sense. Yeah, it's just so great to have the Sunlighten sauna, and it's an especially good hack in winter, I think. Mention Zestology to get $200 or £200 off at Sunlighten Saunas. And now back to the show. And so let's move on to then how people kind of know if they've got this or if they're affected by this or not. And that's probably what people are thinking. People will be listening to this and saying, they might be saying, well, I know there's nothing particularly wrong with me, but I wonder if I could get an extra 5% if I could sort this allergy business out. Or they might be thinking, yeah, I've been suffering with something for ages, I wonder if it's that. One of the things that I found with histamine and histamine intolerance is, I've been consulting Dr. Google an awful lot, Beth, so it's nice to be actually talking to a proper doctor. But Dr. Google tells me it's quite hard to test for histamine intolerance levels, and one of the best ways to do it is to follow a low histamine diet for a few days and just see if you feel a bit better, which is exactly what I did, and I felt loads better. But there are tests that you can take as well, aren't there?
There are some. So for histamine intolerance, you can check.
And MCAS as well, whatever's appropriate.
Yes.
Yeah.
So for histamine intolerance, we can check diamine oxidase levels, and then we can check methylation status. So for histamine intolerance, there's two main degrading enzymes. And then a lot of people don't know about that there are two other backup pathways that degrade histamine as well. And so I tell people if they're suspecting histamine intolerance, and all of my clients that come in, we start here. The same thing you did, Tony. We do a low histamine diet and see how much clears up.
Yeah.
So if people are clearing up a lot, and I also check their supplements because there's some supplements that will raise histamine, and we check medications. So there's medications that will raise histamine levels, and certain things like niacin stimulates histamine release. So I look at how much niacin somebody might be taking in a multivitamin. Fish oils are high histamine. So we take a look at kind of everything that could be high histamine in the diet and in terms of intake, supplements, medications. We pare that down. If the symptoms clear up like they did for you, then it's pretty clear we're dealing with histamine intolerance.
Yeah.
However, if somebody gets a little improvement in symptoms or no improvement in symptoms, but they have a classic mast cell activation syndrome presentation, then we suspect they also have mast cell activation syndrome, because you can have one or the other, or you can have both. I have both. So that's part of what made my symptoms more significant than maybe some other people. What people should be thinking about are symptoms like itching, flushing, breathing issues, allergy symptoms. But again, like I said before, I've got some clients who don't have those classic histamine or allergy symptoms, but they have GI issues and sleep and pain. And I see a lot of people who have done long-term treatments for mold toxicity or Lyme that were kind of aggressive treatments develop mast cell activation syndrome secondary because of the aggressiveness on the treatments, and the mast cells got stirred up, and then we have to go in and calm them back down again. A real telltale sign that can distinguish mast cell activation syndrome from histamine intolerance is when people smell chemicals or foods and start to have symptoms. Or sometimes I have people that as soon as they put food in their mouth, they will start to have symptoms. And I've had, if I put high histamine food in my mouth, before I've even chewed and swallowed it, my hands will start to swell. And that's a mast cell response, because the mast cells can respond like instantaneous. It's so fast. Whereas if it's just histamine intolerance, it can take anywhere from 30 minutes to a few days for those symptoms to appear. So that's one of the other immediate responses.
That's really interesting. I've often noticed, well, maybe over the last couple of years, that whilst, I mean, obviously chocolate's becoming a bit of a theme, but I love chocolate, but sometimes when I put dark chocolate in my mouth, there's a slight kind of love-hate relationship that my mouth has with that piece of chocolate.
What's that mean? Tell me about that. What's that love-hate relationship?
It's almost like it makes me feel a bit sick, but I still crave it because of the sugar.
Yeah. So there may be a little mild mast cell response going on for you. Yeah. Particularly in those oral mast cells and the digestive mast cells. So that's a good piece of information too. When we get to podcast 2, we can touch on that some more. I tell you what happens a lot for people that are dealing with histamine intolerance and mast cell activation syndrome is very few practitioners understand these conditions. And these are the people that are often told that they're crazy because their lab work looks normal. People tell them, well, you can't have a histamine problem. Histamine's naturally in your body. Even though mast cell activation syndrome has now been an official diagnosis for 3 years, I have people regularly come in and tell me they saw their allergist and said they suspected they had mast cell activation syndrome, and they were told, well, you can't have that because you don't have itching or you don't have rashes. Or they're even told that doesn't exist, even though it's officially recognized by the American Medical Association. It's officially recognized by the medical community in the UK. And that's one of the most traumatic things a healthcare practitioner can say to somebody with health issues, is to tell them that they're crazy. And this is the place I go on a rant just because I feel so protective about this with people, and because I had this experience myself, is that's just an excuse instead of saying, I'm sorry, I don't know, which is the integrative thing to say, is I'm sorry, I don't understand, I don't know. To say, well, you're crazy. That's not taking responsibility for it, for the practitioner side of not understanding what's happening. And that's just never okay, and that has to stop.
Yeah, and from my personal perspective, my primary symptom was always nothing to do with a conventional, what you might think is a conventional allergy symptom, but it was just a dodgy gut all the time. Just spent 25, 30 years trying to figure it out. But we'll get on to podcast 2, because I wonder what you'll say about that and analyze my tests.
But on the mast cell activation syndrome, the big thing is if somebody has mystery symptoms in 2 or more systems that doesn't make sense with anything else, nobody's figuring it out, and they've done the baseline blood workup to see that there's nothing else going on, that's when you start to suspect mast cell activation syndrome. So 2 or more systems could be brain and gut. So we don't have to have rashes and itching. That's a skin system, but it could be skin system and muscle fatigue, or any 2 systems is where we're going for with mast cell activation syndrome.
And then, what do you recommend people do if they're thinking, I wonder if I'm part of the 9 to 15%, because presumably this affects people in all different ways? And I quite like the title of this podcast, are allergies killing your performance? I'm guessing there's some quite high level sportsmen and women who suffer from allergies in various different ways, and their performance could dramatically get better in a completely different way if they were to look at this issue.
Right. We can think about performance with athletes. We can think about performance in terms of people who are running businesses, even performance as being a busy mom or busy dad.
Yeah.
Just energy that we need in general in life. So I worked with 2 world-class athletes, who competed on the international level and won on the international level. Very intense athletic performers. And they did not have early presentation or childhood presentation of mast cell activation syndrome and histamine intolerance. But they were, one was in mixed martial arts, and the other was bodybuilder, weightlifting. Both of them were working out anywhere from 40 to 50 hours a week, just the workout. And they were pushing themselves so hard for these competitions, which I understand people being driven for, but they weren't listening to their bodies. And I'm sure you know about this, Tony, that when you're doing bodybuilding at that level, you have to extremely limit your calories, pay attention to what the calorie content or consumption is. You've got to stay in your weight class.
Right.
And so they were getting off nutritionally. So the man who was a bodybuilder, he was eating a very odd diet to prepare for this competition, really pushing his body so hard. And just the stress of that brought on the mast cell activation syndrome, and he got a parasite at the same time and ended up with histamine intolerance as a result of the gut inflammation. The other one, who was the mixed martial artist, he was also a world traveler and had been through a number of different countries and ate all over the world. But he ended up with Lyme and mold toxicity at the same time. And he went from being a world-class athlete to flattened. And he couldn't do a single push-up. So in both of these, we started back at the basics and identifying the root causes, taking out the histamine triggers, the mast cell triggers that were in their environment, their foods, even the supplements that were mast cell triggers, and then started from the ground up and started to regain. And fortunately, the good news is they are regaining their health and they're doing way, way better. And I think sometimes, we look at these as extremes of our culture around performance, but even work cultures are pushing people too hard.
Yeah.
We're pushing ourselves too hard. And the mast cells it's almost like their programming gets a virus in it, if you can think of it that way. Not a literal virus, but kind of like a computer virus could mess up the programming. And when they get dysregulated, then instead of just firing at the invaders, because the mast cell's job is to create inflammation just around an invading toxin or pathogen until the rest of the immune system can come clean it up. Instead of firing just at the invaders, they start to fire at the butterflies and the meal delivery people. And then that's where performance is going to go down, is when that dysregulation happens. So we've got to work harder on maintaining our health because of these toxic physical environments we're living in, but also emotional environments. And we've got to be more strict with our health and our foods and how we take care of ourselves than people had to be 50 years ago.
So, bearing all that in mind, I always think a great approach is to work with an expert like you, and it's better than trying to figure it out on your own. But what is a kind of first step for someone listening to this thinking, yeah, maybe, what should I do next? What would you recommend?
Yeah, definitely the next thing I would do is go to mastcell360.com. And there is a link there at the top of the menu. This says MCAS. And just take a look at where underneath that menu it says, what is MCAS? And there's a list of the different symptoms there. Just see if they sound like you. And there's a link there to a symptom survey. And if you score 50 or more on that symptom survey, I'd be thinking about it. Here's the thing with mast cell activation syndrome is there are some things that you can do Dr. Google. What should I do for a cold sore, or how can I get over the flu faster? That works great, and people can kind of DIY if it's not extreme, and they're going to find a lot of great information. Mast cell activation syndrome is so complex that if you don't have a degree in healthcare and have that kind of training and have a specialty in mast cell activation syndrome, it's impossible to figure out. And I work in Facebook groups. I help moderate histamine intolerance and mast cell activation syndrome Facebook group. And we've got 14,000 people in there. And, I just see hundreds of posts every day of people struggling to figure it out and not being able to. So if you think you have this, you've got to find a functional practitioner to help walk you through it and help you get the right labs and build a custom plan for you. So I work with people remotely, and there are a handful of good functional mast cell activation syndrome practitioners. Not a lot yet, because this is still a new area. And the thing I tell people is, if you don't have the time to put work in on your health, this isn't the road to go. It does take work, and it takes people from 6 months to 2 or 3 years, depending on how ill they are. But if you can put the time and the work into it, you can get way more than 5%. I see people turn their lives around, people who couldn't leave their homes, traveling again, and just getting their lives back. If somebody's got, decent health and they're looking for 5 or 10%, you can definitely get that. If you just take the toxins out, clean up your diet, that's going to happen. If you're really, really sick, there's quite a lot that can help people get better, but it does require working with a practitioner.
Well, something I've asked everybody, Beth, I'm going to ask you as well, is what is one book that you would recommend and one tip for living with more energy, vitality, and motivation? What's your book?
Yeah, I think I really like this question. The book that I'm thinking of is The Last Best Cure. And it talks about how it's a woman who had chronic illness and was really struggling to get well, and how she just really pulled back from her over stressful lifestyle and focused on taking care of herself. And she brought in some breathing practices, and she did a lot of work on her nervous system balancing and turned her life around. Now, she had a very rare condition that nobody knew how to help her with. And that piece that we talked about before, the mind-body connection piece, made a huge difference for her. That was a game-changing book for me.
Okay, excellent. And then what about one tip for you?
Biggest tip for me is we have to have clean food. We have to have quality air, and we have to have clean water. If we don't have those things, we're bringing toxins into our bodies. And very few people have that. I mean, they may be working really well on eating cleanly, but they haven't thought about all of the VOCs being released by new furniture in their home or new construction, or they're not thinking about whether they're just doing an entry-level charcoal water filter, and there are so many pharmaceuticals and toxins in just tap water. Even if it's considered good city water, there's a lot of toxins in there. And so what are we putting in our bodies that are causing the hormone disruption, the immune disruption, and how do we remove those triggers? That's the first step I take with everybody, is remove the triggers, and then let's see what's left over, and then let's bring supplements on board to help the body.
Yeah, we have a Berkey water filter here, which is probably one of my favourite gadgets of all time. It's so simple, but it's just so good.
Yes. The Berkey's good. Yeah. AquaTrue's good. Yeah, there's some really good water.
What was the other
filters.
one you mentioned?
AquaTrue is a good one. It's a countertop water filter.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I thought about that today actually, because not the water but the clean air. We've moved to a place quite near where I work at Sky now, and for the first time today I thought, I'm going to walk to work, it's going to be lovely. And so I walked there and walked back, and it took about 45-50 minutes. It's about 2.5 miles, and I love walking, so I felt very energised. But unfortunately, the second part of the journey, or the first part of the way back, is pretty much right the way along a main road. And not only was the air quality disgusting, there was like so much noise and intensity in traffic. It wasn't actually an enjoyable trip, and I thought, this is probably not benefiting my health anyway because of the quality of the air. So I might not be doing that one again.
Yeah, and then I'd love to, if I could, squeeze in a bonus tip.
Yeah.
Which is, so I have a free report for people on the website, and it's the 7 root causes in mast cell activation syndrome. It's also the 7 most common same root causes in histamine intolerance. And so if people go to mastcell360.com/free report, they can download that report and then take a look at it and be thinking about which of these apply to me, what's involved in my specific case. And that's the first step on a functional approach, so they can get themselves started right there with that free report.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, I as I said already, I think it's really great to work with experts in this matter. And I, too, have worked with plenty of different practitioners in my time. None of them told me about histamine intolerance. I looked at that myself. So I'm looking forward to part 2 of the podcast, where we can look a little bit more at histamine, mast cell activation syndrome, and a whole load more. And I would urge anyone listening to this who wants to look at it more to get in contact with Beth, because it's obvious that you've got a really kind of rigorous approach to this, and it also comes from your own experience. So shall we ask listeners to pause for a week and then get ready for part 2?
I think that's great. I can't wait for part 2.
Okay, part 2 is going to be all my test results. And what if you've wondered about getting testing in the past, this is the podcast that you want to listen to, because we will also go through the process of how you can get tested and how you can analyse the results. So we'll see you then. Beth, thanks for now. Quick reminder of your website.
So it's mastcell360.com, and people can also go to mastcell360.com/free report to get the free download on the most common root causes in mast cell activation syndrome and histamine intolerance, and see if this looks like it's something that fits what's going on with their health.
Brilliant. All right, Beth, thank you for now. We'll see you for part 2 on the next Zestology.
Thank you so much, Tony.
That is it. Thank you to Beth O'Hara, who is back next week for part 2. And the reason I've done a part 2 with Beth is I kind of, touched on it in the podcast, but a lot of people ask me how they can track their own health and wellness and what the markers are you should look for and what you should go for, how you can interpret the results, what tests you should do. And a lot of people just don't know much about it. So next week on Zestology, I'm going to get tested, take the tests, get Beth to interpret the results and the absolute best tests that she would recommend. So it's Beth O'Hara on Zestology next week. Very excited to say that also coming up very soon on Zestology, I'll be recording a podcast live in an infrared sunlight and sauna. This could be the worst idea I've had in podcasting in quite some time, and that is because after 40 minutes of kind of being in the sweatbox and feeling very hot, I'm not going to be making much sense. But that's going to be fun as well in the sunlight and sauna. And this podcast is brought to you by Sunlight and Saunas. The histamine diet is definitely number one for me in terms of game changers. Number two and number three, probably meditation and sauna for detox. So plenty more on the Sunlight and Sauna coming up. If you would like to contact Sunlight, and you can go to sunlightandsaunas.co.uk and ask them any questions you like. And whether it's detox or better sleep or anti-aging, there are so many benefits to getting into the infrared sauna, quite apart from the fact I'm recording this podcast inside because it's so cold. And a good place to warm up is the infrared sauna. Actually, only today, I did probably the longest infrared sauna I've done in quite some time. I was in there for almost an hour. I was really sweating. Often I go in quite a short amount of time. And let me tell you, I feel like I'm going to sleep so well tonight. It always helps my sleep, but I do feel tonight's going to sleep really well. So thank you to my partners on this podcast, Sunlight and Saunas. Do check them out. Do mention Zestology as well. That'd be really awesome. And next week, we'll see you for a bit of testing, bit of tracking, something that I really love doing. And Beth O'Hara will help us interpret my results next week. Until then, have a great week. Have a zesty one, and I'll see you soon.